history and not that boring old stuff with your hosts, Glen and David Crane. This is a weekly YouTube stream and podcast that takes a quirky look at the fun, the absurd, and the dark times of history. So, it has been a little while since my last my last podcast adventure. Has been a little bit of a while, about 3 or 4 years since my last chat. So here we are again, giving another go. And this time I've got my co-host Dave, a good friend of mine from for the past, gosh, how long have we been friends for now, Dave?
I think it's 15 years there, Glenn.
15 years. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I am old enough to have a friend for 15 years now. So that's quite exciting. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself there, Dave?
All right, everyone. So, obviously Australian. So in terms of the history stuff, so I have, out of interest sake, so I've done a master's in ancient history in late antiquity as a speciality through Macquarie University, and I am currently halfway through a master's in science in archaeology from University of Glasgow. So so the last one has been particularly interesting with its a focus on Scottish history from post-Roman world to about the 12th century.
Oh wow. So what got you interested in that little field?
Well, this is more, so the Master's History is more history look. So this is archaeology side, and this is more so the archaeology of what happened in Scotland from when the Romans departed. I find this really interesting. So it's along those late antique lines. So they call it late antiquity from the Roman times until the collapse of the East Roman Empire, not the East Roman Emperor, but the East Roman Empire became Byzantium, and so called that. So it's more along those lines. So what happened in Scotland when the legions returned to Rome? And who went where and who are the Scots? So there's quite interesting. So it ended with the kingdom of Scotland in the 13th century. Pretty much around that time is where I ended up. But I did go out to the capital of the Picts in Forteviot area and had a look at some picnic sites around Perth in Perthshire, along the River Tay in Scotland.
And not the Perth that you and I are quite familiar with here in Australia.
That's right. And as the Scots were shocked to learn, is that when I said, I spent a couple of years living in Perth, you were in Perth? When did you live in Perth? I said, not that Perth, Western Australian Perth.
And yet still...
So I had to quantify that. So
and founded by a Scottish...
Now I'm back in... Yeah.
So
it was Stirling, obviously. That's why it's the Stirling Highway and the... and I can tell you from being in Perth in Scotland and Stirling in Scotland, it looks nothing like it. The Western Australia, absolutely nothing like it.
Righto. Look, I have not been to Perth in Scotland myself, so I will have to take your word for it. But I'm going to say that if it's anything like Edinburgh, which I have been to, it certainly doesn't look like Perth either. A lot more cloud and a lot colder.
For all the viewers, the famous thing, yes, that's true. The famous thing that's near Perth is so the capital of the Picts was in Forteviot. So when they formed the Kingdom of Alba, they're not exactly sure when, about the year 1000, they moved the ceremonial capital, and it was only a royal ceremonial capital, to Scone, so which is only a couple of miles northeast of the city along the River Tay. So which is an interesting spot.
So this is actually quite interesting that we're talking about this, Dave, because I'm actually currently studying also through Macquarie University, for those who've come in late. We're currently looking at from Charlemagne to Game of Thrones, and it talks about the fact that when the Romans packed up and left, they took literally everything with them, including all the writing, like all the people that could do recordings and the like. So I'm assuming that it must be quite difficult with studying the Scots, certainly the Picts, not having a great deal of writing left, and then furthermore with the Vikings coming in and finishing off the job, it'd be quite difficult to study that.
That's true. So they've picked out, there's so it's got various names, but there's a manuscript which I believe in France. So a lot of stuff at the time in Scotland. So the Kingdom of Alba was Gaelic. So the Gaels are from island, and then they kind of moved into, they were called Dalretia or Dalriada, and that was the kingdom. So Scotland, basically, the kingdom of Alba was comprised the kingdom of the Picts and Scots. So, and the Picts weren't wiped out by the Gaels. What they think now is they assumed their culture. Well, at the ruling class level and at the king level. So, basically, the king of the Picts became king of the Scots, is what they think. And he spoke Gaelic. So the Picts spoke a Celtic language as well, and they think the ruling class adopted Gaelic and made it so they were adopting European practices of early medieval times and having a common language across. So the Kingdom of Scotland at that time, so the Kingdom of Alba was from the Firth to the Forth and north. So basically, if you draw a line between Edinburgh and Glasgow north, that's its kingdom, which also included bits of Vikings as well. So that's traditionally Scotland. So south of that was the Strathclyde Britons, which were basically the Britons that the Romans Romanized Britons, and there was a few Angles and stuff later on. But yeah, so Scots are quite the mix. So Glasgow and that area is really the kingdom of Strathclyde, which was a Briton kingdom,
Righto. So
which is interesting.
would it be safe to say that Scotland was cosmopolitan in that nature then?
Yeah, well, they do. In what we were reading in early medieval times, is that they spoke a bunch of languages. So if you're in Dumfries and Galloway and areas like that, so you had like Viking, you had Gaelic, you had Britain, and you had also Old English or Anglo-Saxon, basically. So, so it was the Kingdom of Northumberland was on the northeast coast that stretched up towards Edinburgh. Yeah, so there was a bunch of kingdoms there. So, and there was also Gaelic across from Irish Gaelic that came across the Dumfries and Galloway. So it was quite a mix, the Scots. So they reckon they were quite bilingual in depending on the period that you look. But we're talking between the Forth and Carlisle. So if you want to know, actually, at one stage, the Strathclyde Kingdom, and it became the Kingdom of Cumbria, or Cumberland, which is now Cumbria, which is named after them, was stretched down past Carlisle, actually.
Oh, wow. That is quite an empire, all things considered, about Scotland, and especially the
But the
history.
Picts weren't. Yeah. So it really didn't come together till the 12th century, and then everything was written. So there's 12th and 13th century became Scotland, and so they incorporated those areas south of the Forth, like down to where the modern borders are, down to the Tweed, basically. So which was pretty interesting. But at the time, but we'll go back. So if you step back in time to around between 900 and 1000, so what we get from what manuscripts, Gaelic manuscripts, do describe Scotland is, and the main one's the Poppleton manuscript, which is in Paris, because that's where it was written by monks. It's written in Gaelic, and it's also got the Pictish king list in there. But it was basically, yeah, so which is interesting. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around that. I don't have my notes; they're coming in my sea freight, and they're in. And just for everyone out there, like a person, my sea freight's got to spend 14 days in quarantine. So I'm not sure if they actually do COVID tests on it, but apparently they do. So good work, Australia Border Force. So, like a person, my sea freight is quarantining for 14 days. I did bring one text with me.
Oh, here we go.
From the course. So,
sorry, Dave, it's a little bit blurry. Oh, from Caledonia to Pictland, Scotland to 795. Well, there you go.
So that's the official history. So that's the yeah.
So for those,
it's a bit blurred.
For those who are wondering about David, David has been living in exile in Scotland for what, 2 years now? Recently, Dave?
2.5 years.
Two and a half years. Dave is over there on business, and after spending a lot of time in self-isolation in Glasgow, he has finally come back to Australia. And also a shout out to my mate Bax, who is in Border Force, so you better look after my mate Sea Freight. I know you're listening, so be careful with him. So, wow, I think we need to come back and do a whole episode on this one, Dave. And I think that would have to be almost an episode dedicated to your studies, because I could sit here all day and talk about that. So that's really cool. So, and
yeah, it was very interesting.
Also, I am nowhere near as smart as Dave, if you haven't already figured out. So, whereas Dave is a guru Josh in all things engineering, science, and history, I am still doing my bachelor's, like my undergrad in Bachelor of Arts. So, One day I will get there. So please come to my graduation. Um, so, all right. Well, we better get to the show, Dave, because we've been here for a little bit, and I think the viewers and the listeners would love to hear what we have to talk about today. So, can you remind me what our word of the week was?
Explore.
It was. And so my wonderful girlfriend, Nicole, she kindly drew the word out of a hat. So that is a little bit of an, uh, dare I say, gimmick, where we don't actually think of the word ourselves. We draw a word out of the hat and then we follow up with that with a little story. So today I'm actually going to be discussing controversy in the Arctic. And Dave, you're going to be talking about what again, please?
We're going to talk about World War One and the Ottoman Empire and Australia's role in invasions of the Ottoman Empire in 1915
Sounds fantastic. If I'm looking forward
and
to it.
16 and 17.
Oh,
So
we didn't quite
people
leave.
always think of, yeah, well, they always think of northwestern Turkey, i.e. Gallipoli, but we also were in Palestine as well, which was the charge of, it's not the charge of the light brigade. What am I doing? It's where we had Australian light horse. I always think of there was a light there somewhere,
There was.
and so we were
There were
involved
horses.
in Palestine as well. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, Beersheba definitely did not end in tragedy for Australians that day. So, look, you've already started. So let's start with you, Dave. Let's kick off with Australia in World War One.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and I've been to Turkey and explored all that area well before it was kind of cool, I think. So I was there, took the opportunity due to cheap flights over the Sydney Olympics. So I wasn't in Sydney for the Olympics and went and travelled around Turkey for a couple of weeks, which was pretty good. Including, so it was out of sync. Obviously, there was no one there, so went down and had a look at Anzac Cove and Gallipoli and stuff, and then went down southeastern Turkey and down that way as well, and then spent a lot of spent some good time in Istanbul and then flew back. So yeah, but it was interesting. So some interesting time there. So, but when you're down there, you got to think about some of the stuff that went on. Yeah. So obviously the Anzac Force was part of it, but if you actually do read the history, and I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure the French and the British suffered more casualties than Australia did. And the Anzac Force did, I'm pretty sure. So
I did not know that.
So the French attacked coastal Turkey, and then the British came from Cape Helles at the southern tip of the entrance to the Dardanelles, and then the Anzacs, along with the British, but did Anzac Cove there. But it's interesting. But talking about it, I don't know. I think about these things. So everyone talks about it, Australians though, but I'd like to know. And another thing I haven't researched, but were they actually? Well, they're Australians because Australia formed, but would the gentlemen that went to Turkey, were they actually Australian on their birth certificates?
That's a very good question there, Dave. And it sounds
So
like
if you were born in 1890 in New South Wales, would you have Sydney, Australia, like I have on my birth certificate, or would it be Sydney, the colony of New South Wales?
So have you seen any records to further this suggestion?
No. So the only ones I've seen are my great grandfathers who are Anzacs, and they were born in the UK. So even though so when it came, so I have got their Australian Imperial Force documents, and it still says Australian Imperial Force, but it says place of birth Aberdeen or Derby. But I always wondered what someone who was born in Australia might have there in place. So
well, to
that would be an interesting thing to read.
any avid listeners or watchers, if you know this, could you send us some information? We'll provide details at the end of the episode. But we would
It could
love
well be, yeah.
we want to
Well,
know.
you never know yeah, because I think the average age of the combatants on the Australian side was 27. So they obviously weren't born when Australia was a country. So you'd like to know. They were older, a lot older. So I'd like to know what actually their birth certificate said. I'm not saying it doesn't mean they're not Australian, but when we say Australians at Gallipoli, probably their birth certificates might probably have their different colonies, but you never know.
So probably one of like, wasn't there a 14-year-old that served at Gallipoli? Um, so I guess that probably the only true Australian with that sort of information.
If you offer birth certificate, I just think
Yeah.
it's interesting to note that. So, for instance, the very first Cerberus, or one of the first naval ships we had, wasn't called HMAS Cerberus. I think it was HM. It was like Victorian ship. It was
It was
HMV. Yeah,
Victorian
so it
colony
was
ship,
named
I
after
believe.
ship. I believe, yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So
So I wonder, yeah. So it's probably so it's interesting like that. I'm not saying we have to change history or do
mm,
anything, but I just like to. I think it's interesting if you think about those things.
I think that ties
And
in well.
obviously, yeah,
But that ties in well with we've bantered about this in the past, certainly on our way to Splendor one weekend, uh, where you actually mentioned that a lot of us, let's call them Australians, um, actually joined up for a reason, and it wasn't actually to go to war, so to speak.
yeah, I can only go off what my great grandfathers did, but some of them did it as get back to Europe and see, because some of them were immigrant workers like we have now. So they'd only spent a couple of years here, and so they looked at it. They didn't know the war was going to be that horrible, so they thought it'd be a quick thing in a colonial style war. So it was a free pass to go back to Europe, and when you get a bit of leave, you can see your mum and dad in the UK, and then when you finish your leave, you go back to Gallipoli or the Western Front, and then you ship off back to Australia. So, as people would do, and I'm sure they went there for other reasons as well. But in terms of when we're saying we fought for freedom at Gallipoli, it wasn't really because, as everyone knows, after the war, the Ottoman Empire, except for the Turkish bit, was divided between the British and the French. So you can't really say that the Arabs got their freedom because then they became, instead of they exchanged the Ottoman masters, who were at least Muslim, for the Christian ones. So the French took Lebanon and Syria, and the British got Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. And
Yeah.
they still had Egypt. So there you go. So much for freedom. So the Middle East was divided. So it went to the colonial powers. So you can't really say that was freedom. The Turkey won its freedom through Kemal Ataturk, so who fought in Gallipoli, and then defeated the Allies, and then the Greeks pushed back an invasion, and then established a capital in Ankara in 1923. But obviously, for the rest of the Ottoman Empire, they ended up under the French and British colonial powers, so they didn't get their freedom at all. So you got to wonder. So you got to take the freedom bit out of Gallipoli. Whose freedom was it really?
Mm. So
Were we fighting for the Turks to get freedom? I don't think that's how it was meant to be, but it's interesting. I just
no.
think that was interesting. Yeah.
So no, wow, okay. So I guess for those that
Because there's a lot of talk about freedom, if you think about it, Glenn, that comes out of government and things. But if you look at it, no one actually in the Ottoman Empire got their freedom.
because did um for, I think it's quite well known that the Greeks and the Turks aren't well known for liking each other, and I think to
Hmm.
this day there's still a lot of rivalry. But even more so, like definitely after the war, the Greeks were pretty much given free pass to really run amok in Turkey and really cause a lot of mayhem uh, to the Turkish.
Uh, I think yeah. So there was a little bit of yeah, I think both did. And then there was a population exchange. So
Oh, wow.
probably you'd say it was 50-50 either way. So there was still a lot of Greeks living in Turkey at the time, so in the Ottoman Empire, especially along the coast. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's another history thing, but Australia waded into that, and now it's our most famous campaign. But yeah, I'm not trying to change it again. I just think it's interesting to think about those things because if you look, so what happened at the end of the war? No one had their freedom, and then Turkey had to fight the Allies to get its freedom. And then, yeah, and that was it. So Palestine never got its freedom. Came under British jurisdiction, and and Syria and Lebanon went to the French. So,
So
well, I just thought I'd just like put that out there. So,
definitely. Now, look, I think there's some really interesting things that come from it, and I think a lot of people forget Turkey. Well, the Ottoman Empire was quite a substantial empire. Like we all know, it was as far as the existing empires were at the time. I think that was sort of on its last legs anyway, and needed a catalyst. But they are still a player, and I believe, casting my mind back here, they'd actually ordered several dreadnought battleships off the British. And when the war started, Britain reneged on its sail and kept the dreadnought battleships for themselves, and Turkey went, thanks, we paid for those, and simply just joined the Central Powers. So we could have had that free walk to Russia, I guess, maybe, probably not. But if the British had done their deal, and I think that's a very important person to really mention, who was in charge of the Admiralty at the time. So
Winston Churchill.
that's right. Depending on how you look at him, he was considered a great prime
I think he
minister.
was removed from his position afterwards, but everybody makes mistakes. So,
Yeah, he became a grenadier guardsman. That's how far down the line he got knocked back. After.
Yeah, they put him in the war there, so he went and got some experience in the Western Front. But anyway, so I just thought, no, I'm just airing those views. You can see I'm quite relaxed about it. So
Look,
but,
I think there's a very important, going back to Winston Churchill here. What was the actual outcome meant to be for the invasion of the Ottoman Empire?
was to knock Turkey out of the war.
Yep. Righto. So that didn't work.
Was knock them out of the Central Powers. No, it didn't in the end. But there was some old bloated empires there, the Habsburgs in Austria and the Ottomans. So the Ottomans have been around since the 13th century, 14th century in that part of Europe and the Middle East or Asia Minor. But so displaced the Byzantines. But and then the Habsburgs have been there in Austria for a while as well. So it was the Holy Roman Empire, and then Napoleon ended it, and then it became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it became bloated again, and then it collapsed after World War One as well. So, but
and then got annexed into another empire. Ugh. Yeah.
Yeah. So
good
I think we're coming up to our break in 2 minutes, actually, Glenn.
No worries. Well, I better let you get to that, and we will come back after these short messages.
No short messages.
All right. We'll talk in a moment. And hi again there, guys. We just had a short break while Dave dealt with some dinner there, so we're back online again. So, how was your dinner there, David?
It was good.
Oh.
So I needed that, and
Excellent.
that's it. So let's get on to your topic, Glenn.
Beautiful. Well, while you've recharged on that, I've been recharging on Smokehead whiskey. So a very smoky Islay whiskey. So totally not an alcoholic, but I do like a wee dram. So, so there you go. So as I alluded to earlier, I am dealing with controversy in the Arctic, and in particular, the ill-fated Northwest Passage by Rear Admiral Sir John Franklin. So a long time ago, when I did my first podcast, and you might have listened to it, Dave, I discovered that doing a podcast of history leads you down a rabbit hole. And I was initially going to talk about 3 crazy adventures in the Arctic. And as I started delving into just the first one, I found that it was actually quite difficult to study, like to put in the stories of 3 Arctic explorers into one neat package. So I think we do need to come back to them, notably Peary, because by all accounts he did not find the North Pole at all, and it seems like he was a thief of tales and a thief of meteorites. So I think he'd be a very interesting person to speak about. And also Roald Amundsen, the first person to make it to the South Pole, and he also had a pretty miserable end in the Arctic Circle. So I think he'd be very interesting to talk about in the future as well. So, as I said, Rear Admiral Sir John Franklin. So, again, for those who come in late, I'm a former Australian Navy person, so I do find Navy stories quite interesting, but I really do find the old adventurers quite interesting. Certainly when we really didn't know what was out there. I think that's quite safe to say, wouldn't you think, Dave? Like in this world of GPS, those guys were really working off nothing more than compasses and sextants. So
Correct.
yeah, so
The old school navigation.
old school, very old school. So but one thing I really do appreciate, whether you like the Brits or not, one thing that you can't buy your commission in the Royal Navy, and I think that makes them a lot more competent than their army brethren. Who, well, we talked about the charge of the Light Brigade, and there's a perfect example of what happens when you buy your commission. It all ends bad. So yeah, so look. Well, while Antarctica is significantly colder than the Arctic, its northern counterpart has actually seen a lot more explorers and adventurers see their ends up there. Notably because it's Western civilization certainly uh, exploded up in the northern reaches. It definitely saw a lot more whaling, and with whalers came a lot more interest in exploration and trying to get to more resources. So
So
there
you
was
mean it's closer to Europe?
and closer to Europe, yeah. So all of that, and once we
Less far to travel.
exactly, and so and before the Panama Canal was opened, if you wanted to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you had to go down from Europe to America, to the western side of America. You had to go down past Argentina, down past Tierra del Fuego, which is also insanely dangerous in its own right. So they were huge interest in finding the mysterious Northwest Passage up in Canada. So Rear Admiral Sir John Franklin, he was certainly tasked with trying to find that. But before he got to that, he actually, like I said, he started off as a junior sailor, so I can definitely attest to that. But I certainly did not make it past the grand rank of able seaman, whereas he rose through the ranks a little bit more. But interestingly, where the rabbit hole started opening up for me was how much he'd actually explored uh, in the early starts of his career. He actually came to Australia back in 1801 and actually was with Matthew Flinders and was part of the circumnavigation of Australia for that voyage. So that in that alone, that's a remarkable adventure. And I've actually seen those charts at the Australian Navy library down at HMS Albatross. That was quite cool to actually handle those charts.
Here's some interesting news. I think it was Matthew Flinders, but they unearthed his body when I was in the UK in 2019.
Oh, okay. I did not know that. What?
Yeah, it
What?
was one of the railway stations. I can't remember which one. I'd have to do some more research, but I can't remember. But I quickly Google. But yeah, so the Australian High Commission did a ceremony there
Oh,
for his reburial. So I'll just bring it up. So I'm just on Dr. Google.
Australia has a amazing history with important English persons like Arthur Phillip, for
Yeah,
example.
so there you go. So according to the BBC, and I do remember this now, so remains of explorer Matthew Flinders was found in the HS2 dig. Yeah, and they're going to return home. So yeah, his remains were identified after an excavation at St James Burial Ground in Euston, London, in 2019. So it'll be reinterred in St Mary and the Holyrood Church in Donington.
Oh wow. Gee.
Yeah, so returns by it follows request by his descendants and local community that it be returned. So there you go. We'll be going back to Donington. So the HS2 is the high speed rail that's north to Manchester. But yeah, so there you go. So they found his remains there. So they got the Australian Embassy in as well. So
Oh wow.
yeah, so
Wow.
Captain Matthew Flinders was buried at the site at St James Cemetery in London. However, the headstone marking his grave was removed in the 1840s and was thought his remains had been lost, but then they found it. And then they identified his coffin.
Oh wow. Whoa.
So I was going to go down for it, but I had something on, so I couldn't go. So yeah, so there you go. Archaeologists discovered grave of Australian explorer Matthew Flinders. Well, he wasn't really. They call him Australian explorer, but he's obviously British.
No, he was far
So once
from
again,
Australian.
they went out, spent some time in Australia, and then went home. And then And then, like all good naval officers, was buried in St James Cemetery in London. So
So that's a Navy cemetery, is it?
I'm not so sure. I just made that up,
Oh.
actually. So,
You had me
but
going
yeah,
there,
yeah.
David. Hey, look, it's better than
But
Arthur Phillip, who fell off his balcony after a massive drinking session in Bath. So,
there we
um,
go. So yeah, they uncovered and they did a ceremony. So he's gone back to Donington, where he's from in the UK. So and he'll be
ah,
reinterred in his hometown.
well, hope he likes motorbikes. Isn't that the motorbike
Mm,
Grand Prix track?
something like
Yeah.
that. So there's a
Oh,
bit of
no.
nip nap and trivia for you. So,
There you go. Wow. Already
so I was
we've got
present for that in the UK.
we have definitely gone down some crazy rabbit holes here. So it's got to get crazier in a moment. Um, so not only was he involved with that second navigation, he also fought at the Battle of Trafalgar as well. So he actually served under Lord Nelson. So he definitely was involved in some serious actions. He also fought the French again because England doesn't like the French at New Orleans. So there's another piece of history I didn't even know that Britain was involved with, which is a war against the French in America. So that's another fascinating piece of history I wouldn't mind learning more about. But looked, it was actually that adventure with Flinders that really got him thinking less about going to battle, but actually more into exploration. So he actually, 3 years after the Battle of New Orleans, he actually commanded a ship, the Trent, which I think is a fantastic name for a ship, the Trent, in an attempt to actually try and find the North Pole by sea. So unlike Antarctica, you can actually, theoretically, you could actually sail there if we get enough global warming. Certainly, submarines break through the ice at the North Pole, and that has happened. If you look at old Cold War photos, you see a lot of US and Soviet submarines breaking through the ice. But as you can imagine, with an old sailing ship, it wasn't going to happen. So he gave it a go, but they found that that was just not just undoable. But it didn't stop him from exploring. He actually went to America again, and this time he actually started doing a lot of land exploration in Canada from 1819 to 1822 and 1825 to 27. So he certainly wasn't afraid to get amongst it, really get into the rough edges. Um, so yeah, after that trip, he actually came back to. He went back to Britain and got knighted, and he was given governorship of Van Diemen's Land, which we now know as Tasmania, from 1836 to 1843. So yeah, he definitely had a lot. So he found himself involved with the colonies quite a lot. And when he was in Van Diemen's Land, he was known as quite a good leader in terms of he was um, well, certainly as an officer anyway, he was a good leader. He was competent and he was well respected by those that served around him. He would make strong decisions through learning from others and experience. Problem is, when you're in the Navy, when you're in charge of a ship, you're definitely you have to keep everyone alive. Your decision is final, and because out on the high seas, especially back in those days, it's life and death. When he took over governorship of Van Diemen's Land, he was not just in charge of military people; he was in charge of free settlers and jail folk, like prisoners. In fact, it was actually considered a dual colony of free settlers and prisoners. So he definitely had his hands full. Interestingly, especially for a white settler, he actually had tried to foster good relations with the indigenous folk there. And he was desperate to try and get all three types of people, so the indigenous, the prisoners, like the convicts, and the free settlers, to come together in some form of peaceful unity, much like what he would do when he was in charge of a ship. But a lot of the people there thought that was terrible. The convicts were considered uh, less than human, and I think we all are aware, um, settlers thought that indigenous people were less than that again. So not a very good time. So he found himself actually quite lonely. He actually led pretty much via his wife. So he actually would seek consul through her. So he actually found himself quite a miserable governor. And so he actually, whilst he did leave a legacy. He set up the Royal Hobart Yacht Club, sailing club. So that's where the Sydney to Hobart finishes each year. So he did leave a pretty cool legacy in that. But unfortunately, yeah, even through his best efforts, he he really struggled to get Van Diemen's Land up and running. So he went back to England, and he finally, but as part of his promise was if he did his governorship down in Van Diemen's Land, he would get to do another exploration, and this is the one that he's most famous for. He really wanted to find that Northwest Passage. So he was given command of two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, both Royal Navy ships, and there were 128 crew members with them. Whilst these were sailing ships, they actually had steam power, so they were actually quite advanced. Like, you got to imagine that the Royal Navy was already like they ruled the waves, so here they were now implementing steam technology on ships. So it made this passage attempt a lot stronger than previous ones. Um, so the plan had been that they would break through the ice. If they got caught on an ice floe, that was okay. They had 3 years worth of supplies, so they weren't likely to starve to death. That was the plan. With the steam, they would have had heating, so they actually were quite well advanced for such a trip. But even at some point, his wife, Lady Jane, she actually got concerned. She actually called in the Royal Navy at Greenwich there to start doing a search party because something just didn't feel right. She started hitting up clairvoyants to get answers, so she definitely got a little bit desperate and even called up the author Charles Dickens to start getting some support. So yeah, something definitely wasn't right, and that was a long way away from from Canada. So, but the Royal Navy actually said it's okay. He's got food, and so they didn't actually do much, and pretty much they just disappeared for what they literally just vanished. So naturally after 3 years, people went, okay, that's not good. They didn't come back. What's happened? 129 people have just disappeared in Canada. So over the years, there was many quests to try and search for Franklin and his crew. Lots of people actually went up to try and find any hint of what happened to the two ships. And so how many years was it? So he attempted in 1845. It wasn't actually broken through for another 60 years in 1905 by, as I mentioned before, Roald Amundsen. So there's actually a huge gap of time before anyone could actually make it through. But over the adventures, the local Inuit, actually spoke of a mysterious metal knife. Now I mentioned about a meteorite a little earlier, and that was the only source of metal for the local Inuit. And so for them to have a metal knife was already that raised a lot of flags. What's going on here? So they actually started looking a little bit further. And there are stories from the Inuit. This is pretty morbid, Dave, and you might have seen my photos on Instagram recently of frozen dead bodies from the expedition. And there was one, even the Inuit have a story of that, of where in the cabin of one of the ships, they found a solitary dead body sitting in the cabin with a large grin on his face. Now, so you've got Inuit. They haven't seen too many white people, and now you've seen this big ship, and inside there's a guy with what they're pretty certain is a post-rictus grin. It's not a good look. So they're not quite sure who that is. Local legend is that was Sir John Franklin, but nobody could verify it because the ship had disappeared. So but it gave a good insight that somewhere up there, there's two ships still up in the Arctic. So over the next 1.5 centuries, people would actually keep looking for them, and they're still looking. And I've got some great stories about that, where people would go and find graves. They actually found a number of graves, and because it was permafrost, they actually were able to open the graves up, and inside these massive slabs of ice, they found 4 bodies. Of various crew members, not of Sir John Franklin. They still haven't found him yet. And so they've actually been able to do a lot of positive identities of a lot of the crew members. But by starting to find these graves, they're actually starting to able to find diaries. So what they know, what they had planned to get frozen. There was always that knowledge that they were going to get frozen up in the Arctic there. So they they tried pushing through, but after a while they realized we can't do this anymore. We've got to pull out. So they actually turned around. They actually um, so in the summer they had actually planned to. They were hoping that the ice would thaw. It didn't actually thaw very much, and by that stage, 3 crew had actually already died. So they got given proper burials in 1846. They turned around um, to go south again, but again they got trapped in more ice, and so they were proper frozen into the Canadian ice. I haven't been to Canada, but from all accounts, Canada's really cold. So for these guys to be trapped in the ice, I can't imagine it'd be a lot of fun. Um,
Well, it used to be cold. Climate change has sorted that out. They wouldn't have a problem these days.
well, that's a funny story. That actually is one of the most a crazy thing that's at the end of this what I've discovered. So this will blow your mind at the end.
Human-made climate change has like changed the rules. They could have just sailed straight through these days. If they did it 150 years later, they would have been fine, Glenn.
Well, they had the right idea. Climate change has been found to have started back then. So because of all that nasty steam power. um, so the crew really did try
Or
and
the Industrial Revolution.
we can blame the British for that too. And in my last podcast, I blamed the British for atomic bombing Australia. So it just keeps following through here a little bit. So the crew did try and keep fighting on. So that's pretty much. It's definitely they were fighting for their survival now. But Sir John, he was age 61, so that's pretty amazing that he was still pushing for these adventures in his late 50s, early 60s. But he died. He actually died on board his ship. Um, Again, according to the local Inuits, a large structure of liquid-like stone, so apparently a volcanic type stone found up there, was erected by the men and has been suggested to be his burial cairn in order to retrieve his body and bring home to England. So that was a way that they could identify from a large distance where an important person was buried. However, to this day, that cairn has not been found, so Sir John is still lost somewhere in the Arctic wilderness. So by Good Friday of 1848, the remaining crew are like, we're done. We've got to get out of here. So um, certainly after another 26 men had become ill and they died as well. So the crew was starting to get, it really was not looking good for them. But we talked about the food before. They weren't dying because of lack of food, but because of what was in the food. And also their own health. So in an era where medical checks weren't done, the crew showed huge amounts of tuberculosis. So many of the crew in the necropsies that have been performed, they're infected so badly with awful conditions that it's amazing that they even made it this far. So also they found that they are all suffering from scurvy, which is crazy to think because the Royal Navy really did come of age because they discovered that vitamin C staved off scurvy, which meant that they didn't die at sea. Yet these guys were all like everyone from the officers to the crew to the Royal Marines that were on board, they were all showing massive signs of vitamin C deficiency. So what it looks like that they actually had boiled the vitamin C out of their food. So all this fresh food, or not fresh food, but the preserved food that was intended to stop the scurvy setting in, looks like it helped drop them off. And to make matters worse, they used lead solder. That looks like it leaked into the food. So definitely, like, so put it this way: the necropsies that were done. I'm just reading off my notes here. They had lead levels of 228 parts per million, with some having 600 parts per million, compared to the 22 to 36 parts per million of lead that the Inuit were found to have, and that the BMIs or the body mass indexes of the dead showed them to be terribly low at 15, when the normal BMI is meant to be between 20 and 30. So these guys were cooked. They were just bad. Um, One of the Royal Marines that has been found, he even showed signs of being eaten by rats. So whether he died it got eaten before or after, they're not quite sure. But this was a nightmare trip. And then and also with lead, it also creates psychological problems. So there was huge amounts of anxiety and paranoia. They're trapped in the ice. This is Dave. You and I have been on a pretty bad trip. That is a nightmare trip to befall all nightmare trips. So, look, I don't know how people volunteered for these crews, but look, hats off to them. But it's certainly something I don't think I could do. The the crew kept traveling south with what they could, and in the end, they actually made the decision to evacuate the ships. They the it seems like because the ships were so packed into the ice, they figured it was easier to make a sled out of the lifeboats and try to push off south by foot. But then mysteriously they found that they came back again. They actually went back to their ships. So after they created these sleds and traveled a fair way south, and the local Inuit had seen them traveling south, it appears that they didn't reach out for help. I think there's a sense of arrogance from the crew here, or maybe the paranoia definitely had crept in. But they went back. They went back to their ships, and they know this because they finally found the ships. Eventually, so they went back to the ships, and then the ships didn't go further. It looks like they all just, from what they can gather, they either died on the ships or they tried to evacuate the ships one last time, and a huge number of them, about 26 of them, fell down a crevasse and died there. So, like, just if it could go wrong, it went wrong. So we talked about global warming, Dave. Global warming is part of the reason why they've been able to find the two ships, because all the ice has started melting away. But then it leads to a funny thing. What is old is new again, Dave. I don't know if you knew this, but the old enemy is starting up again. And it's not the French, it's the Russians. And the Russians are trying to claim ownership of the entire Arctic. Canada, funnily enough, does not like that. Canada thinks that's a terrible idea. And they had a rather hard right prime minister who really didn't like that idea. He thought that was bad. And certainly in 2007, the Russians actually planted a titanium flag near the North Pole via a remote-controlled submersible and said, North Pole is even ours. And so Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, to foster Canadian nationalism, started exploring the Northwest Passage. And one of his prime objectives was to find the Erebus and the Tower. So in 2014, the Erebus was found. It was beautifully intact. In fact, the photos are absolutely amazing. There's only a little bit of damage at the stern, and that's where they reckon the ice has impacted on it. And then two years after the Erebus was found, 2 years and a day to be more precise, the Terror was found 60 kilometers away. So there's a huge amount of distance in between. And that's where they think that the crew went to the Erebus after they tried to get on the sleds the first time round and tried to sail south. So that's why there's a huge gap between the two ships. This is all using very scant evidence. By this stage, the crew, those that could keep notes were not keeping notes. There was less material to do this. So at the moment, it's all rather subjective. So how does Russia get involved with this further and the rest of the world? Well, the Northwest Passage is losing a lot of its permafrost. So global warming has seen all that permafrost leave. So whilst in one regards, it certainly takes a lot of pressure off people having to use the Panama Canal when they're traveling east to west and vice versa. But at the same time, permafrost is pretty important. You don't want to have that leaking, like disappearing. But also it means that people are now able to get hold of the oil and gas reserves there. So there's a lot of people very concerned that the natural wastelands up there are actually disappearing and being allowed to get hold of the gas and oil. So here we are, over nearly 200 years since that voyage, and we're still seeing the same problems that were concerning back then. They're coming back today. So it's quite amazing to think that with everything going on in the South China Sea and in the Pacific Rim, that we're seeing a lot of these issues playing out. Before I wrap that up, though, just the other day when I was putting some notes together, I discovered the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation recently published a story in August where the remains of one of the crew of the Erebus, Warrant Officer John Gregory, was positively identified using DNA, and he's the first member of that crew to be identified doing so. Interestingly, his great grandson, who provided his own sample for analysis, is an engineer also, and was quoted as finding it eerie to be linked to an engineer on the ill-fated expedition. His remains have sparked a large number of questions as well, as he was one of the oldest crew members and appeared to have survived much of the trip, more so than some of the younger crew. So keep your eyes open for more revelations from the Northwest Passage, because I think there's a lot to come from it, and certainly just trying to find that cairn of Sir John Franklin would be quite amazing, I think. So yeah, so there you go. So um, from the Battle of Trafalgar to Australia to Canada, yeah, he definitely got involved with a lot. But yeah, interestingly, just disappeared. So there you go. So what do you think of that, David?
Yeah, it's interesting. So
Hence why it's called interesting history and not that boring old stuff.
it is.
So, look,
19th century. But here's the thing: were they really exploring if the locals were already there?
that is a very good question. It did
Why
cross
is
my
it
mind.
exploration when it comes to Europeans? But as you said, they kept running into the Inuit, so it's not really exploring, is it? Because it had already been explored by the locals.
Yes. Wow. There's. Gosh, we could go down. See, I really should have called this podcast "History Down the Rabbit Hole," because I think we definitely take a lot of local. I think even today, I think a lot of local knowledge gets taken for granted. And I personally think a lot of these crew members would have survived if they'd actually struck out a relationship with the Inuit. And I reckon the Inuit probably would have also known some trails. They must, like, they've managed to survive there
I reckon
for.
if I was the Inuit, I'd just tell them, "You idiots! What are you trying to do? The place is frozen. Why do you want to sail that way?" So,
Exactly. We don't travel up here in this time of the year. Why are you traveling up here this time of the year? So, um, yeah, and like I said, I think there's a sense of arrogance. I don't know if that's what you get. That's the vibe you get from a lot of Western exploration. Even I don't know, like
I don't know if it's Western exploration, but I just asked. It's just a simple question. It's not really exploring if there was people already there.
well, yeah, like yeah. Wow, you're definitely throwing me some curveballs here today, Dave. So it's like you're a historian. You're always trying to pick apart, looking for the truth somewhere.
No, I'm just saying.
No,
So,
no, this is good. So when I look at it, it definitely comes back to let's be honest. It's definitely not exploring when people actually are already living there, isn't it? So, and then you definitely can look down the Australian path of where Australia was rated as what was it, terra nullius for
mm.
far too long, when in actual fact there are whole nations, like nations of indigenous people already living here, and then um, foreigners turned up and said, "Have you got a flag?" So, if you haven't seen that amazing YouTube Lego video by I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He's an English comedian. Yeah, he does an amazing sketch of "Have you got a flag?" And pretty much Britain's rule of the world came down to if the country didn't have a flag, Britain owned it. So, so I guess there's a sense of that. Even though, yes, so even though the Inuit were certainly there, they were certainly living there, and they were certainly thriving compared to the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines that turned up for a
Well, that's the
legitimate.
thing. So, if we look at the dictionary for explore, then it depends on what they say. It depends on how they couch as explore. They definitely weren't the first humans there.
No,
But if they were the first humans to sail the passage, then as the locals did, why would you need to sail the passage when it's frozen most of the year?
yeah.
So, so it's not really exploring. Is it really exploring? It is exploring for them because those particular people hadn't seen it before. But it's not really heroic because
Other people,
people had already done it.
yeah, and they were thriving.
Yeah.
So yeah, and certainly not eating lead helps. Like it, yeah, as you saw, lead's not good, bad. So um,
Anyway,
there you go. So yeah, that's today. Yeah, we're talking about Australia's Dave exploring Australia and Western powers fighting in the Ottoman Empire, and I'm looking at the oh, here we go, the controversial look of whether Sir John Franklin was even exploring when it was already explored. So
just a point. So the word of the day was explore. So was he? He was exploring for himself, but he wasn't the first person to do it. Because
certainly
there's
not.
whenever we think of 19th century explorers, there's use the term explorers. It implies that no one had been there before, which is most of the case. That was never the case, except for Antarctica.
There you go. Which, as we've spoken
Hmm.
about, not many people had actually even made it there. So
Hmm.
there you go. Wow. So, and that, gosh, we could go down the rabbit hole of Carl Sagan saying that we shouldn't even explore Mars because if there's even if there's microbes there, it's still theirs, not ours. So, where do we stop, David? Where do we stop?
Well,
So, all right. So, on that note, we'll have to wrap up. But just letting you know, the word for next week has already been drawn out of a hat, and that word this week is medical. So, Dave and I will look into
well,
the history of medical. So don't forget to subscribe to us on whatever podcast device you use, podcast app you use. Also subscribe to us on YouTube. We'll be putting that up very shortly, so keep keep your eyes peeled on that one. And also follow us on Instagram. No boring. On Instagram at No Boring History, and on Twitter at No Boring History. So, yeah, don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to having a chat with you next week on interesting history and not that boring old stuff. Have a great one. See you, Dave.
good night, everyone. Bye.
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 And we're out.